Okay. All right. We are now recording. All right. So welcome everyone to this session talking about language as identity. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And there we go. All right. And if everyone can just remember, at least at the beginning, to mute yourself. And then as we get into our discussion portion later, we can unmute as needed. So, okay. Walika Nawalewak, Karel Delawens, Wanantuko Ni. It's good to see all of you. And today I'm going to share with you a little bit about Nanakook and Lenape language and identity. And so first, I just want to go ahead and ground us in a brief geography of Lenapehoking for those of you who are not as familiar. And so I have these images on the screen of pre-colonial Lenapehoking and Nanakoking, which mean the land of the Lenape is Lenapehoking and Nanticoking is land of the Nanakook. And so on the left side of the screen, we have pre-colonial Lenapehoking here shaded in green. And as you can see, it encompasses what is today New Jersey, Eastern Pennsylvania, Southern New York, and the northern part of Delaware. And pre-colonial Lenapehoking was not one single political nation, but it's made up of many different communities that were connected by shared kinship, history, culture, territory, political affiliations, and language. And you can see the different bands of color are representing the different language varieties that are spoken in Lenapehoking. So that light green at the top is the Munsee dialect or that northern dialect, whereas that dark green in the south is the Wenami dialect. And then that narrow band in the middle is the Unalaktico. And you can see that the center of Lenapehoking is really centered by the Lenape Sipu, which is the Delaware River. And our people lived in the floodplains of Lenape Sipu. Today, the Lenape people, that river, and even this state are all called Delaware today. And that was the English name given to all of us. And it was named after a baron or Lord De La Warr, who was an English lord and a governor of Virginia in the early 1600s. And then, but Lenape is the name that we call ourselves. And then on the right side is Nanakook territory, which is also centered along a river, the Nanakook River, which has also been named after our people. And so you see that down in the Delmarva Peninsula. And the word Nanakook means people of the Tidewater because we are people who are really, really connected to these waterways. And the Nanakook people descend historically from the Lenape. We call them our grandfathers. And so a very long time ago, we were part of that Lenape nation, but we moved further south into the Tidewaters to become the Nanakook people today and are, although connected through kinship, a distinct political community. So Nanakook and Lenape are both connected through their shared languages, but they're also connected to a much larger language family. And you can see how big it is here, everything shaded in orange is all part of this Algonquin language family. It stretches down the eastern seaboard into the Great Lakes, across a huge part of Canada, as well as out further west as well. And all of these different nations on the right-hand side are part of this language family. And
that if you put all the elements in order of their
please make sure you mute yourself.
that the chemical properties appear at regular intervals.
And so
the properties create
our language
one of the earliest periodic. So this doesn't look a lot like our.
There we go. Okay. So our language family, it's called the Algonquin language family. And one of the there's an interesting historical anecdote about why it's called the Algonquin language family, because many of our communities actually, not just the Nanticoke, but many of the communities here shaded in orange, recognize that the Lenape people are the grandfathers, one of the oldest communities that others have descended from. And so when we're talking in that context, we think about this language family, maybe it should be called the Lenape language family. But the reason why it's called the Algonquin language family is because the Algonquin are a coastal community in the sort of northern northeast part of the country. And when colonial linguists were going and trying to document and categorize these languages, that was the first group of people they met because they're a coastal community. So they met them there. They asked, who are you? And they said, we're Algonquin. And so that and so they were like, okay, they're Algonquin, and they are the language that they speak is Algonquin. And so they continued to travel up and down the coast and further inland. And as they met other communities, they recognized that that these languages that these other communities spoke were similar to that first community that they talked to. So then they decided to name the entire language family after that first group. But within our communities, one of the ways in which we've been trying to decolonize the ways in which our languages and our communities have been categorized is by reorganizing them in ways that make sense to our communities and the ways that they are connected. And so that's why many folks have considered calling this language family a Lenape language family. But the languages in this family, as I said, they're very closely connected. They have very, very similar grammar structures, many similar pronunciations and vocabulary. And many of them are mutually intelligible, so you can understand them across languages to a pretty high degree. And so they're able to help each other with language revitalization work. Because the next question I want to talk about is, how do you even go about revitalizing a language that has maybe only a few speakers, or in the case of Nanticoke, none at all? And one of the ways to do this is to lean into that large language family. So Nanticoke has no living first language speakers and hasn't for several generations. Our last speaker died in the mid-1850s, so it's been a very long time. And our archives consist of only a few vocabulary lists that were collected in the 1700s. You see in the center here, one that was recorded by a man named William Vans Murray. He was hired by Thomas Jefferson, a former President Thomas Jefferson, to record what remained of the Nanticoke language in the mid to late 1700s, as well as a missionary named Heckewelder, which is this green print on the right. And he also went and recorded some vocabulary from the Nanticoke language. But these vocabulary lists, they consist of fewer than a couple hundred words, and there's no grammar, there's no sentences, they're just words and their translations. And so when you think about only having these small dictionaries and these small vocabulary lists as your only archives, revitalization seems very daunting. However, it becomes a lot more realistic when we realize that Nanticoke is not an isolated language. It's not standing on its own. We're not an isolated community, but it's connected to Lenape and to that broader Algonquin language family. And so we're able to share some of the archival resources from other communities in order to help us reconstruct our own. We can borrow words from similar languages. One example that we did this with is for the word for grandmother, nokum. It means my grandmother. And nokum is a word that is very, very similar across many languages within this family. And so we were able to very sort of strongly assume that nokum is the way that we would say my grandmother in Nanticoke. Another way that we can also use this family and this is something that our linguist who we work with has done. He has been really working on researching Proto-Algonquin, which is that root language that all of the languages in this family come from. And so by studying that root language, then he's able to reconstruct forward new words in Nanticoke based on the patterns of sound changes that we're familiar with. And so these are some of the many ways in which we can use these small lists to actually bring back the entire language, as well as not having to guess about things like pronunciation and grammar because of the language family and the many different examples we have of how our words are pronounced and spoken. And so our sister, so this is our Nanticoke community, which is that tiny community in the Chesapeake. But the Lenape language family is a much larger community of people and of speakers. And so I had said before in the previous slide that there's sort of that Munsee Northern dialect and that Unami, that Southern dialect. And the Northern dialect has been maintained by communities that were pushed up into Canada. And they've had some living speakers up until the last few decades or so. And so they have worked with linguists to create a dictionary. That's the one on the left that you see, the red dictionary, that has many, many hundreds and hundreds of words in it, as well as working on other more accessible language resources for their communities, because it's very hard for anyone to really learn a language from a dictionary, from an archive. And so some of the work that our communities are doing are figuring out how to create more interactive resources and other opportunities for language learning. And so the southern group of Lenape speakers, the Unami speakers, are mainly out in Oklahoma. And one of the things that they've been able to do with their remaining speakers is to work with linguists to record their stories and their words. And one of the products that they've created is this open access online dictionary that is open for anyone to take a look at, and you're able to look up words and phrases, as well as sections that will tell entire stories and songs. And so many of our different communities are working on all of these different ways to bring our languages back into the mouths of our speakers. So going back to Nanticoke, I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done to take Nanticoke from those two tiny old dictionaries to where it is today. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're working on the Nanticoke language book, which the cover here is pictured on the left-hand side. And this is a book that we just published last year, last August in 2023. But we started working on it in 2020 during the height of the pandemic, when everyone was in lockdown, during that May, June period when we didn't know how long or how bad it was going to get. But we were all just, at home baking bread and trying to figure out how to occupy our time. And so what we decided to do in our community was to write this book, because we had been talking about it for a really long time, but we weren't really, we didn't really have the time and the ideas of how to bring language back to our community of speakers. But we started by writing a children's book. And one of the elders on the project was very interested in making sure that this book was geared towards our children. One, because our children are the future, and they're the ones who are going to be carrying our language into the future and into future generations. But we also figured that this language book is going to be reaching all language learners at the same level, because we're all starting as beginner language learners right now. None of us had the opportunities to learn this language as children, to learn it as a first language. And so whether or not we're children or adults, we're all starting at the beginning. And these lessons that are geared towards children, that are simple and easy to remember, will work for language learners of all ages. And this project started several, before my generation, so several decades ago, there were many elders in our community who really wanted to try to work on bringing Nanticoke back as a spoken language again. And they reached out to members of our language family, particularly to some Ojibwe cousins up in Canada. And they had a woman who came down to help us with some of these reconstructions. And so these word reconstructions. And so this book here that we have created is really sort of sitting on the shoulders of that work that they initially started. We've decided to lean more heavily into borrowing from Lenape rather than from Ojibwe, just because the language is slightly closer. And because we now have a linguist that we're working with who can do the historical reconstructions, we're also creating new words from that. And so we titled this book, Once It Has Been Spoken, It Cannot Be Unspoken, Katikitawakanan. And Katikitawakanan means our language. And we thought that would be a really great way to really bring everyone into this, this practice of learning our languages. So this book, we were able to get it published right before our annual powwow in September last year. And so we were able to present this book to the community with ceremony, as well as including and creating a song that really highlights that our language will never be silent again. And in addition to this physical book that we created, it also comes with an audiobook, because it was really important for us to know that this language is going to be spoken, it's going to be heard. And while, as you can see on the right, as an example of language lessons, we give both the word in Nanticoke a sort of phonetic suggestion, as well as the English translation. We really also wanted people to be able to hear the recording of the words. Because when we learn our languages, it helps us to understand the world, how our ancestors saw it, and how they walked through the world, and helps us to create a bright path for future generations. It also helps us to heal from that trauma of genocide of our people and our cultures and our languages. We often think about that physical violence that was inflicted on our communities, but the violence on our languages was just as severe. And thinking about violence in terms of erasing the erasure of our place names. So the idea that Lenapehoking today is called places like New Jersey and New York. And most of us don't really think about how those names came to be, but just remembering that these are words that are actively working to replace the native languages and the presence of native people in these spaces. And even words and even place names that still maintain their Lenape heritage, like the city of Hoboken. That's actually a Lenape word talking about pipes. And but the connection of that word to the people and to the language that it belongs to has really been disconnected. And so relearning our languages and reasserting our sovereignty to learn them and to speak our languages and to have them heard really helps us to heal from this trauma of violence. It also helps us to heal from the trauma of the federal and church-run boarding schools in which, our children were removed from our communities and stripped of their names and languages, their culture, their families, and were forced into American identities and forced to grapple with American ideologies. And so I want to talk a little bit about how some of these ideologies really impact language particularly. And so these are some examples of colonial language ideologies that are still continuing to impact the ways in which we think about language and impact our practices to revitalize our language. So the first one being this idea of linguistic nationalism, the idea that distinct nations have distinct languages. Lenape is not like that at all, because one, our communities are in diaspora. Like I had said in the beginning, Lenapehoking was never one single distinct political community, but sort of this conglomeration of related communities that spoke a variety of different dialects. And as we're revitalizing the different dialects of Munsee and Unami, those are being revitalized across multiple communities, not in distinct ones. And so really trying to disrupt this idea of the connections of like speech communities and political communities. Another big one is this concept of standardization, the idea that languages should have this homogeneous standard. And this is very particularly relevant to written language. So as we're creating these written forms of language, it really tries to get us to create like single standards for them. Whereas there's a lot more fluidity in spoken language. Our languages, our Nanakok and Lenape languages, and other languages in the family are very they're um they're very descriptive languages. That's why so many of our words are so long, because instead of having one word talk about one thing, it's usually a description of something is how we talk about these words. And so there's a lot of different ways to describe things in the world. And so there's a lot of fluidity and variation in our languages, as well as there's a lot more fluidity in things like noun and verb order. And so when we're creating these written forms of language, really trying to find ways to maintain that fluidity and not adhere so much to these colonial ideologies of having a very standardized language. Another one being this idea of purism, the idea that languages shouldn't change too much or have too many borrowed words. As we are revitalizing our languages, we have to borrow from each other, but also we recognize that the lines between our languages is not very solid. It's very fluid, and really wanting to highlight how important it is to maintain that fluidity. And as well as this last idea of wordism, the idea that language is primarily about words, but there is so much more that is communicated in language than just words themselves. Um, and one example is how the ways in which we greet each other or depart from each other. And so in our languages, we'll say things like lapich or hulapikanawal, hulapichkanawal, um, which means I'll see you later or I'll see you again. And even as we have mainly become English speakers, within our communities, there's still a practice of using I'll see you again or I'll see you later rather than saying goodbye, which is sort of the standard English way to depart from each other. And so really highlighting this idea that goodbye is such a final term, a final idea, that we would rather keep this idea of I will see you again. Even if we don't have it in our language, we're still keeping that concept our in the ways that we greet and depart from each other. And so I've had many people ask this question of why should we revitalize our languages? What values do they hold? Isn't it just easier for everyone to speak the same language? And so I wanted to talk about some of the ways in which our language communicates more than just words. And so one of the things that learning our languages does, it helps us to connect to our ancestors, to reclaim those traditional ways of speaking and the worldviews embedded within them. And one of the really important things that's embedded in our languages is this concept of animacy. And so it is a grammatical structure that exists in our languages as well as in English. And so in English, we talk about animacy through the use of pronouns. And so when we're talking about our fellow people, we use those animate pronouns of he, she, or they. And then there's a bit of a hierarchy that's created when we're thinking about different beings in the world and how we refer to them. And so under humans, you may have familiar animals, which is animals that you know, like your pets or something like that. And they may get those animate pronouns, the he, she's, and they, when you're talking about them. But then underneath that, we have other animals. We recognize that they're living and alive, but oftentimes, if we're talking about the squirrels or the birds or the deer outside, grammatically, we talk about them with the inanimate pronoun it. Like I see a squirrel, it's scrambling through the grass there, it's climbing a tree. And we know they're alive, and yet it's still grammatically correct to use that inanimate pronoun. And then we think about other things like trees are considered things. We know that they're alive, but they're not necessarily considered animate in the same way that people or animals are. And then things like water and rocks and the earth are all just considered inanimate things. And so in English, you really have, people up here with those animate pronouns, and then animals, trees, rocks, tables, cups are all grouped into those inanimate structures. Whereas in our Nanticoke and Lenape languages, we actually recognize far more of our world to be living and animate, and it's reflected in the grammar of our languages. And so it is grammatically correct to talk about people, animals, trees, celestial bodies like stars as living beings. And so I want you to consider what that does. How does that change your relationship with that other being? So look at these two sentences. When I say, look at that tree, it is tall, versus look at that tree, she is tall. And so just kind of thinking of that little grammatical shift, like how that really shapes and changes how we relate to those other living beings. And so relearning our languages really helps us to solidify many of those different connections. And relearning our languages also helps us to connect with our other groups of Lenape and Nanticoke speakers. Because of the violence of colonialism, we are scattered all across Lenapehoking. We have communities that are out in Oklahoma, some in Wisconsin, some in Canada, and in New Jersey and Delaware and Pennsylvania and Kansas and many other places. But many of us are brought together through this connection to language, both contemporarily and also historically. So since the earliest parts of our removal, we have had individuals who have traveled between our different diasporic communities searching out speakers. Um, and so and many of these speakers have done different collaborations across the communities. And the influx of that pandemic also created not just time for us to write our book, but also time for us to think about other digital and online communications and collaborations through language work. And so through that, many language classes were being offered online. And so this really opened up the possibility of participants from going from people who lived locally so that they were just in walking or driving distance to those classes, to now community members that don't live in community or across community, between different communities, people could take language lessons and relearn the languages. And speakers and teachers were able to collaborate on new levels because of these online collaborations. And so I was able to actually, during most of the pandemic, I was able to take part in a virtual Munsee language class that was taught by a teacher based in one of our Ontario communities. And this class brought together speakers from both of the communities in Ontario, from people in Wisconsin, from speakers in New Jersey and New York and Delaware. And we were able to reconnect with our distant relatives over language learning and really also connect on political work and social work as far as bringing our communities back together and also strengthening them. And so I want to talk just for the last part here, just a little bit about what some of those collaborations have looked like. And so one of the ways in which we've been using our language for political work is, I call it this work of translation. And so this was done by one of our Munsee teachers in Ontario. They were working in collaboration with the government in Ontario about providing posters for their website to encourage people to get the vaccine during the pandemic. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the work that this multilingual poster is doing, because everyone who speaks Munsee also speaks English. So it's not doing the work of of a basic translation that you understand the words in both languages, because everyone who can read Munsee can read English. And there are very few people in our community who actually can read Munsee. Most people are second language speakers, and only, they know it, the language orally, they may not know it written. And so some of the work that this was doing was very much social work rather than language work. And so part of it was to encourage people to trust the vaccine because they see it being promoted in their language. And so for people who were very nervous and hesitant about getting the vaccine, this was a way to encourage them to get it. Also, the translation of the word vaccine itself in the language, because there isn't a specific word for that. And so they decided on the term medicine, witchapikal, which is medicine. And that as a way to also really help connect and to make sure that people understood that this was a safe and healthy thing to do for our communities. It also provided our communities with a platform to have a sign in the Munsee language on the government's website alongside signs in English and French. We're really there to elevate our language and to put it on this same level playing field with the English language and with the French language. And so there are, many different ways in which we have been using language to strengthen our political claims and ties into with the governments, whether they be the US government or the Canadian government. It's also been a way for us to reconnect more deeply with each other, with those ancestral worldviews, and those life ways, the ways in which our ancestors lived. And so participants from that online class came together in person. We came down into Lenapehoking. We were hosted at Princeton University in New Jersey, and we were able to, sit together and to do language work together, but also community work and craft work and just bonding. And part of that was reconnecting with our water and the water around us. And so these are some images from canoe journeys that we were doing on ancestral waterways. These particularly are from the canal, so they're not ancestral, they're not a river, they're man-made. Um, but but also going onto the rivers and the waterways and being able to share the language and use it in context. And so, identifying the birds and the trees that we saw around us, the act of paddling and feeling the current and the water underneath us and reconnecting both with that water and with each other in a new way. And it was really just a beautiful thing to have that's the sounds of Munsee and Nanticoke floating over the water like it had done centuries before. And so our people understand that water is not merely a resource. Water is life, water is alive, and water has memory. And long before Elsa from Frozen sang about it, Indigenous peoples have always known that water carries memories. And so one of the things we did at the end of that gathering at Princeton University was for those of our communities who lived in the homelands, we invited those relatives from Canada and from Wisconsin who had never been to and touched our ancestral waters. We brought them down home to our communities so that they could reconnect with the water that our ancestors knew. And so on the left-hand side here, you see some images of some of our women they're standing in the Delaware Bay. And so reacquainting themselves with the water, and so that they can reconnect with the same waters that our ancestors knew that were so important to them. And then this past October, I took part in a water ceremony on Randall's Island in New York City as part of Indigenous Peoples Day. And this image on the right, you see many different folks from both from Lenape communities and from other Indigenous communities and other people who live in the New York area who just care about environmental action and water protection came together to do a water ceremony. And so people brought water from their local waterways, from their river. As you can see in this image, my cousin and I brought a jar of water. We brought it from the Brandywine River up in northern Delaware. And what we all did as part of this ceremony is that we took the waters from our different homelands and from our different places, and we poured them into the East River in New York as this reminder that all water is connected and water connects all of us, and that it's so important. So much of the water around us is polluted, particularly this water surrounding New York City. But it doesn't have to be the case. That doesn't have to be the future of our water and of our communities. And so we poured this water as a way to remember the past and to share our hopes for the future. These waters remember our ancestors, and they'll remember us too. And this fight for clean water, it's not just a human fight, it's a chance to advocate for the return of those reciprocal relationships that we've always had with the world around us, with the living world, the plants, the animals, the water. And learning our languages and revitalizing them and bringing them back to our communities is one way that we can help to strengthen these connections to the world around us. Wanishi.
Wow.
So yeah, I'll stop the screen share there, and I'm really hoping for the rest of this session that we can really have just an open conversation about maybe questions that you have, or all of you are educators, and so ways in which you can incorporate many of these different ideas into your, into your own work.
Wow. Sorry. This is very powerful. I do have a few questions about, well, first of all, love the book. I'm so excited. And the leaders at the Department of Education are aware of it and are working on ways to integrate that into the resources that Delaware educators have. So that's exciting.
Great.
Additionally, I was wondering if you could talk, there's so many things I have questions about, but talk a little bit about, the language moving from, or your process in actually writing the language, right? Because so much of it comes from oral tradition. Maybe were there some challenges there or some decision making that happened when you put it into print? And then I have other questions, but I'll start there.
Sure, absolutely. One of our biggest challenges was to try to figure out what was the writing system we were even going to use. And so one of the early conversations that we had was this idea to create our own unique writing system. And some tribal communities have done this, where we basically create individual characters that represent all of the different sounds, and so that we're able to string them together into words. The problem with this is really just about learning and ease of learning. And so for communities that have done this, Cherokees created their own orthography to a certain extent, so have other indigenous languages. However, they still have a lot of speakers in that community. They have a lot more resources. And so we made a determination that because all of us are starting from the beginning, we really wanted it to be, we didn't want to create more barriers to people learning our language. And so we thought that people learning an entirely new writing system and this language that is still very unfamiliar to all of them would be very difficult. And so we decided to reconstruct the words using the same characters we use in the English language alphabet, and just manipulating them in ways that somewhat reflect the sounds of our language. And so we actually decided to follow the Lenape models. The Wenami speakers in the South use a different orthography than the Munsee speakers. In Wenami, they tend to use a lot more like accents and different like special characters to represent different sounds, sound changes, whereas Muncie uses fewer of those, but they're more likely to use like double vowels and things like that to reflect the sound changes. So their words end up being a lot longer. So we decided, instead of reinventing the wheel for ourselves, because our languages and our language work and projects are so connected to these communities, we decided to adopt the Muncie version of their spelling, and then use that to create our words. So that's and so yeah, so we've modeled ours after the Muncie spelling, and that's where it's at right now. Although we do have some that are in non well. And we're really hoping in the future that we can like, as more people become more comfortable with the language, the spoken language, and we have first language speakers again, that somebody will create a better writing system that really does reflect all of the sounds in this language, because they're not really well represented by these English letters. But that's what we have right now, and so that's what we're working with. I see there are some questions in the chat. I just want to, oh, well, the easiest one to answer for Dawn is the Nanticoke Powwow in 2024. The one in Delaware and down in Milton, Delaware now, is always the second weekend in September, sorry, the weekend after Labor Day. So it's usually around the 8th, 9th, 10th or so, whatever that weekend is, that's when it will be.
So I have a question. I work a lot with the informal educators, so the museums, state parks, and we're trying to create environmental literacy. And so we ask ourselves, who is not sitting at the table? And so I keep saying, we don't have Native Americans sitting at the table. So they haven't been sitting at the table for a long time. So how do we get, in a polite way, Native Americans sitting at the table? Like, we just don't go up and say, hey, you haven't been at the table, now we want you to join us, which could be disrespectful. So what is the correct way, or how do we do that to ask them to come and join, and to write curriculum and write opportunities so kids have an opportunity to explore diverse, especially the Native American ways of Delaware?
Yes. So, well, so generally I would say wherever your projects are, make sure you know what tribal communities to even contact. So in Delaware, that would be the Nanticoke people or the Lenape people. But if you're, coming from outside of Delaware, make sure that you connect with those communities. So there's a couple of different ways to go about this. One being that you can contact the tribal communities. So contact like the tribal council. Most of us, there are, tribal websites, like the Nanticoke have a website and, an email address for, people who are interested in reaching out. And so you'd contact them, and then, they usually would send it internally to whoever it might be relevant for. Also, if you can also, though, like, see what projects are being done by our community. So, for the Nanticoke community, we have an organization that's run by a Nanticoke community that was started by a Nanticoke community member, is run by different members who are part of that community, called Native Roots Farm Foundation. And they have a website as well that you can take a look at. And, one of the work that they're doing is on environmental literacy and reconnecting Indigenous peoples to our Indigenous foodways, but also reconnecting other peoples to Indigenous lifeways and foodways, and those sort of reciprocal relationships with the world around us. Oh, thank you, Melissa, for adding that in the chat.
Thank you.
That's their website. And so I would say, those are two good ways to sort of reach out to, our communities, or if you're at events where there are, Nanticoke or Lenape people who are presenting or who are part of this, speak to them and, start a relationship there, and to see, how you might be able to collaborate with them on different projects. I also will say, though, if you are asking for, you know, participation from our communities to either write curriculum or to build or to work on, you know, very specific projects or to spend sort of time and energy and labor doing that, I would say, you know, don't ask for free things, you know, ask for, um, you know, just make sure that you are, you know, respectful in that request as far as, you know, compensating people for their time and labor, and also recognizing that, you know, there is sort of a lot of emotional labor that I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize that when they are wanting to, bring Indigenous people into certain existing projects, they're, like, for example, somebody may have asked, oh, you know, we're trying to think of something specific, so I'm not talking generally, but we're creating a, you know, a exhibit here, and we want to know the, you know, we want you to tell us what the Lenape word is for this, or we want you to give us a Lenape story that we can incorporate into this, you know, into this project that we're working on. You know, those requests, like you know, on one hand, I do understand wanting to, you know, bring those perspectives in, but also sort of recognizing that there's still a lot of ongoing trauma as to
Mhm.
why those stories are not well known and why, you know, many of us are, you know, struggling to reclaim our languages. And so maybe just sort of thinking through that extra step through some of these requests, about what it is you're asking and our, you know, capacity to, you know, to even be able to or want to answer some of those.
Thank you.
Um. Where's my microphone? Sorry, I just wanted to say, I've been attending the Indigenous and Latinx class at the University of Delaware. It's a joint project with the Library of Congress, and we've had many opportunities to interact and enjoyed some time with Chief Coker from the Lenape tribe. And he's very approachable, very nice man. So he's definitely somebody I would say, I would think you would be able to reach out to, and he would be able to find someone in the community that would be interested in participating in things. But
Thank you.
Great. I'm just thinking back to the book too, and promoting it widely, of course. I think it's such a powerful example of, there it is.
So you can see it in the flesh.
Yay! It's so beautiful. So I love the sort of this notion of, you know, low floor, high ceiling, right? Where you can anybody can approach the text, but like walk away with such a wealth of information and knowledge about the language. You mentioned the audio book version. Is there like a code in there in the book that leads you to that, or do you have to get it separately?
No, so when you buy it from us, you get them together. So right now it's in CD format,
Okay.
which is, I suppose, slightly archaic at this point. But we have it as CD format mainly because one of the things we were working on was potentially making it like QR codes. But at the point when we were ready to publish the book, we did not have the website to house the audio files, and we're still working on, you know, that aspect of the project. And so when you buy the book from us, you can get it, you get the book and the audiobook together as one individual set. The book is available on Amazon and Barnes and Nobles, but that is, you'll only get the book itself.
You
won't
only get the
get
book. You
audio.
do not, I know this because
So you have to get the audio. You have, like, if you want them together, I highly recommend ordering them straight through us. The main reason for that is because they're separate. Like, we have the publisher, publish the book. And then the audios are being produced by an entirely different company. And so when the, producer or when the publisher sends their inventory to places like Amazon and Barnes and Nobles, like they don't have the CDs, they don't have them. So yeah, so that, highly recommend ordering them from us.
I love that. I'm just trying to find your
Um,
link.
Oh
now.
yeah, so okay, so we do have we're working, like I said, it's a very small team, and
Mhm.
none of us are very tech savvy. But the book itself, if you want to, I will put in the chat. We have a email address
Yeah.
that you can sort of contact us and we can give you the information. Sorry, I can't talk and type at the same time, sorry.
While
Um,
you're doing that, and Anastasia and I were having a chat too. So oh yeah, you got it. Perfect. We were we have slightly well, land acknowledgements are like something in and of themselves, all a different topic, but we do often launch with one that we helped write with the elders, and we have included this year's updated version is also around the language acknowledgement. So you were an inspiration in that as well, to include that as part of what we want to honor as we're gathering, even though we're virtual in this space. Also, we're also on the land, and language is a part of that. So I'll
Yeah.
make that public in the Padlet. I'll make sure you get a copy of that afterwards.
Great. Thank you. And, I really do encourage people, as like land acknowledgements and language acknowledgements, they are important. But also just they are, they only have value as much as they are the first step in a process. And so just saying a land acknowledgement itself is it's important for so that people understand whose land and some of that history, but it can't be the only step. And so, and I know this, Melissa, this isn't a critique of your project. I just am highlighting the idea that that it is important, and I think that this organization is using them in a good way, because it is a first step, and then subsequent steps are these other ways in which we are working on, supporting revitalization work and reconciliation efforts and other types of land back practices. So we have a few more minutes if anyone else has any other questions.
I don't really have a question, but I do have just a comment around what an honor it is to have you, and your work is incredible, and you're on the home stretch for your bringing the two worlds together, right? Like the university world and the real work of language. And it just, honestly, I mean, Tanya might be able to speak to this too, but really your session today paired so nicely with our keynote. I'm sending you a follow-up email to that to make sure you have those documents. And it's exciting. And then somebody's asking, what made you study anthropology?
Sure. So I actually had a little bit of a roundabout way to get to that, but when I was a kid, or not a kid, I guess when I was in high school, still a kid, I was really interested in archaeology, specifically because NAGPRA was really starting to be implemented at that time. NAGPRA being the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act. So the idea of returning our remains and other sacred objects back to our Native communities. And so I was initially really interested in being part of that. And so I thought I was going to be an archaeologist. And then once I went to college, I understood that archaeology was housed under the umbrella of anthropology. And my school required us to take classes across all the different aspects of anthropology. And so I learned a little bit more about sort of the biological and evolutionary anthropology, about culture and language anthropology. And so during that, and also being sort of connected with many other Indigenous students and our Native American Studies department, I became really interested in language revitalization. And I knew so many of my peers were working on learning their languages, but their languages had speakers in their communities. And so I was really interested in trying to figure out what could I do to help my community who didn't have any speakers? What were our options? And so, through all of that, I decided, I left, after I finished undergraduate, I worked for a while, and then as I was building my graduate study idea, that I was going to research language revitalization. And then it really developed as I started to do more language revitalization with Nanticoke and with Lenape, recognizing that there are several different communities that were connected. And so my project really became about sovereignty through these revitalization practices, because it's this sovereignty that's connecting our different Lenape communities across this diaspora. And I was really interested in the different ways in which we're all working together. And anthropology, being the study of people and of cultures, it was a really great place to sort of house this interest of mine of writing and researching about how our people are uh, really coming together in different ways to assert a very unique Lenape identity. And anthropologists have been the ones who have been writing about our communities for generations, right? But without much input from our communities, as times when we were sort of the research subjects. We were the objects, And so I also really wanted my work to be sort of a different conversation, a way to write about our communities in a different way, and to add to the bodies of literature that that don't try to sort of condense us into these observable spheres of interest, versus and really see us as both sort of relevant to like the broad like political conversations, and not just these sort of like relics of like ancient people here isolated in this way, but how we're actually all part of these ongoing conversations. So yeah, that is sort of a roundabout way of explaining why I was interested in anthropology.
Incredible. Very powerful. Very powerful. Thank you so much for your time. I've copied the Gmail email account, so you'll be hearing from us for sure about that. And it's a great honor to have you here. And thank you for your leadership. Thank you for the work that you are doing. And I mean, I know for one, there's a whole group of us that are following. So we look forward to so much more, and hopefully even some collaboration.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yay.
Thank you all so much for joining. And yes, I look forward to talking with all of you soon.
All right.
Take care.
Take care.